But what I'd really like to get into is, Atlantis and the visitors who came and ultimately manipulated our DNA. Where do we begin on that topic?
Well, the thing with that is that we begin right now. The very trauma. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, you're coming through. You're coming through fine.
Okay. Well, the thing is that the ancient days, these traumas tie in exactly and precisely to all the types of social and governmental idioms that we see today. The entire power structure of the modern world is rooted in those days. One can argue, as Zachariah Sitchin has, that those types of power structures, this oligarchy begins back then, that they already had it then, that the tyranny already existed then. But certainly that's just a historical anecdote if it didn't exist today. The birth of religion, the religious control to feed on man's emotion and the primal trauma that he felt and experienced when the earth around him was in such a tumult, and also then the genetic interference into his biology that basically made him a schizoid being, and I don't even mean mentally, I mean even biologically. It's so close to us we don't even think about it. You see, all of these were manifestations of trauma, and therefore that trauma is still in its very young stages. The earth is yet recovering from the upheavals, and so is man's psyche. Now, back in those days, I believe there was a visitation, and that the visitation was to create a slave race. It involved, anyway, the creation of a slave race, because the visitors that came here, there weren't many of them, just like the ancient records say. And they basically divined to create a slave race, and succeeded in doing so. But then they had infighting, and therefore other contingent, that I always refer to as the Lemurian side, the sons of the serpent, they then tried to, in their own way, patch up some of the trauma that had been done, particularly biologically. And then this is when the spiritual cults got created. Because now, in order to restore the ancestral wisdom, to return man to his center, required a very elaborate series of rites and rituals, which would take far too long to elaborate on. And this also meant his body. This also had to do with his psychology and his biology, because I believe even the radiation fallout from the various wars that took place thousands of years ago, which again is in the fossil record, it's just been covered up, that affected the biology. It also affected the eating habits, because the flora and fauna had suffered under the trauma, and so man's entire cycle of life, the food chain, everything had been disturbed. So in a way, it was almost like he was a newborn. He was newborn in those days, and he had to live in an inclement society, in an inclement world. And his societies and the walled cities became his only protection. But of course, within his soul, always will be that residual throwback, that fragmentary, distant, lost feeling of connection. And that's what you see in the old creation myths and legends, in the Zuni and the Hopi, when they talk about the Tsarion, the underground world, the time of retreat, the reemergence to the surface of the earth, and the feeling that the gods had retreated and that man had just been isolated. This is then what accounts even for the entire outsider tradition of the man who then wants to become the hermit, wants to go and seek. You see, then all of our mythology begins, all of our history, and all of the kind of idioms of man as we know him today begin. And then there's even more subtle understandings pertaining to the ego and its life. That maybe the ego is not a permanent thing. It could be that the kind of anatomy of our consciousness is something that comes and goes, that has its own life cycle. I believe this is very echoed in the Vedic traditions. They don't state it in this many words, but it's pretty obvious when you read between the lines that there is a sort of a cycle. They call it the wheel of souls, the wheel of Charasi, the wheel of incarnations. That's been misinterpreted as being reincarnation. That's not what it means at all. It's more about the life itself, patterns of life come and go, and that civilizations, they rise and they fall, and the men within it and the experiences that they've had will be lived out again and again and again down through time. Particularly if man doesn't change, he'll meet the same challenges in whatever epoch and whatever age There'll always be the people who want power, and rise to the top and create civilizations based on hierarchy and so on and so forth. So all of these idioms that we now understand and mostly take for granted and have become accustomed to, I believe were born out of the day in which there was this massive violation. And with one part of myself, I'm glad that we're living in where we are now, because as bad as it is still the time for that truth to come out so people can get a grip on all of this and find out what has been happening to them and take charge of it. Because there's no problem that the mind of man cannot create, that the mind of man cannot solve. And therefore, this is what the challenge is. There's those people who just can't leave the handrails, who can't live without their gods and their goblins, and can't live even without Big Brother taking care of everything in their life. They have great fear subconsciously of being alone, of going back to nature, of opening those ancestral doors. And they leave that to the poets and the musicians and the philosophers. And then we have an entire exploitatory movement. You see, because then there's certain men in the world who work out some of what we're talking about here. They work it out. But they're power hungry and they're psychopathic, and then they become the priests, they become the gurus, they become the politicians to just lead the rest of the sheep. They're easily seduced into this because knowledge has its own power, occult knowledge even more so. And many of the people at the highest levels of these fraternities know or are even taught some of the things that we're discussing here. They actually do find out what has really been going on this planet. And they have access to the books, and they have access to the maps that have been suppressed, and they have access to the old languages, and they also have access to the old magical traditions. This has been sequestered by Rosicrucians, by Freemasons and Knights Templar. They have access to this magical powers, and they understand just how vulnerable and weak man is, and they have access to this. This is what gave rise to the cities and to all the different stuff that's going on.
So are they worshipping these beings? Is that ultimately what's going on?
This is another thing which is, of course, important. I would always differentiate my work by saying that these Nephilim, Anakim, fallen angel types, they don't exist anymore. I've theorized that they might, but I still am researching that myself. I've talked about the fact that their bodies have certainly been interred in certain places in the earth, and that's a whole other area that, again, I tried not to explore too heavily in the book because it takes us off on a digression. But ultimately speaking, I think that they're all gone, and that basically that we are their descendants. We have both the alien proclivities and the human, so to speak, proclivities within us, and it's an internal psychological conflict that we've inherited from them. Those people who want to then, those people whose the alien part of them is much more pronounced, will go on to then do ruthless and cold things because they're not even of this planet. They have no concern with us, and that power hunger and that sort of bent way of thinking and existing, and it's basically and ultimately a vampiristic kind of way of life. They will obviously seek to do their own thing, and they'll also want to clan up with others of their same ilk, and that's what we see in the world. We see it in all sorts of areas. And the one who has decided to not do that, he's going to be the outsider. He's going to be the loner, and he has to learn how to draw his own map. A lot of my work reinforces people to do that, is to say, look, this is just the way it is, and you have to cut all ties with authority and just try to believe in yourself enough so that you can live your own life while you're on this planet. As difficult as it is, and it is a prison planet in many senses of the word, but there's also another beauty, there's also another reality under all of that, and it's for you to get in contact with it. Nobody else can lead you there. You've got to get in touch with that ancestral flow that's been so shut off in so many ways, and that's what my work has recently more focused on. I've been interested personally all my life, but it's only in the last lot of years that I've more actively even steered my work in that direction, because I think that's the most important area, and that's the more important solutions exist there, so that we can come to see some of the other traps, both legal and other social. Collectivism. That's the biggest trap. Everybody thinking that we owe something to everybody else, and it's only getting together in groups and bands that we can do something or other. Haven't we even thought that that is itself a blind alley? That's exactly playing right into the hands of these tyrants who themselves are of the hive thought, the hive mentality, you see? So we have to be very careful when we think about change. We know we want change, but we've got to be very lucid about what we want, why we want it, and the way to go about getting it, because we might even make things infinitely worse if we're not careful.
Well, we had a question from the chat room earlier. Somebody asked, how do we get organized and how do we turn things around?
Well, we don't. There's no such, see, in truth, there's no we. The truth is antithetical to any concept of we. There's only a person's individual truth. Truth cannot be shared. Truth cannot be collectivized. And that's where we're at. We have to become aware on a planet that what I'm talking about, that is the bottom line. We haven't got there yet. And previous teachers who've tried to explain this, nobody listened to them at all. We're so geared towards the collective, the group, and that is basically dependency and codependency. It's not standing on your own. It's leaning up against somebody else who's likewise leaning against you. And therefore there's no sovereignty. I said this in the last chapter of the Atlantis book. I gave my solutions there. And I used the metaphor of martial arts. That when you become so immune to the assaults of the other, like in a state of Jeet Kune Do or like Aikido, the whole principle is not to defeat your enemy using the same weapons that he's offered you or that he himself uses. Is to use his own psychology, his own energy against him. In other words, become so subtle, so aware of the nature and the motives of your opponent. And so inwardly strong yourself, psychically and spiritually, mean take yourself to a higher level spiritually. That you will be immune to their attacks. And in that time then, when you have secured a bit of space and a bit of time, then the guidance will come for you to know what you can do. But that guidance speaks to you and you alone. Later, if other things happen on a social level, okay, that's not for me to say, whether it's good or bad. But the initial stages, they're always where the person themselves has to become fortified so that no tyranny or any type of pestilence can enter their field. This is the true ritual. And that's what people are obviously not wanting to do and have not been doing for ages upon ages. We've even killed off all the people who were there to show mankind how to do this. And even that is limited, because really ultimately nobody can show you how to do it. And certainly the doctor cannot get into the bed with the patient if he's trying to cure that patient. The one who draws you a map can only draw you the map. You have to walk and have that adventure for yourself. And that takes a different kind of courage and a different kind of strength. So what happens is, down through time, every time man has tried to set up something that will offer some sort of resistance, because he hasn't really done the true inner work, that thing that he sets up becomes tyrannical immediately. Because he carries within his own psyche the very seeds of the problem. He doesn't deal with the problem in itself. So therefore everything that he replicates, everything that he tries to create, and this even goes for the top philosophers who try to literally sit down and draw up plans, for different kinds of societies, different kinds of relationships between men. And it's never worked. We've had the finest minds on it. Communism was actually a version of this, in which some very intelligent people realized that, look, we have to free man, and he's just a slave, he's just a worker, he's being used for the labor of his body, and we have to do this. The whole American experiment was along those lines. Even though I said that, we talked earlier about it was misgiven in many ways. But in principle, ideologically, it was meant to be a way in which if man was given all the kinds of material needs that he could possibly want, and let's not doubt that man does have those things, way so, that then he'll become a happier individual. This was the whole pretext behind behaviorism, behind Calvinism. It's still the underlying ideology in the New Age movement. But of course it's not sustainable. And the reason is, which I've been saying for umpteen years now, is because man is refusing to look at himself as a man. His entire image of himself and his image of his fellows is based on a collective social persona. He doesn't even concern himself with himself anymore. He's concerning himself only as other people see him. And therefore this is a social persona, which of course needs to exist. I'm not against it. But I'm saying that has become so overly developed and overly strengthened that the other stuff, the true individual call, the real meaning, the real questions of the meaning of life, that has been put aside. Because see, no matter where you are, and under no matter what kind of tyranny you exist, and no matter what situation, I don't care if you're in a dungeon or you're in a palace, the same existential questions and the same the same existential impulse will arise, which is, what are you doing here on this planet? What is your reason for existence? Why were you born? It goes back to the old philosophical overarching question about why something as opposed to nothing. Well, okay, that can be answered on a metaphysical level, but that same question can also be fractalized. It can be brought into every other aspect of life. Why this is opposed to that? In fact, let's take one little small example. Why have a conscience and then have survival? And why does conscience only come after survival? Why does it not come the other way around? Why do men have to do the deeds that later on they feel sorry for and realize, oh, that was bad? Why could conscience not come before action? You see, so we have to, then you can go into those realms. You have to think about psychology. You have to think about philosophy. Why this is opposed to that. If it was the other way around, my goodness, we'd be living in a totally happy existence where man would already know without anybody telling him what is good and what is bad. Mm-hmm. Why does he have to learn this through experience? So we have all these existential questions that are there from the beginning of time to the end of time. While we have this consciousness, we're bound to ask them. So people can either start asking them, or they can continue not asking them and distract themselves, as the Monty Python Meaning of Life movie showed when they're all in that boardroom so brilliantly with a touch of humor. But the point is that you can either continually distract yourself in the minutiae of the world, which is never ending. The sensational, domestic, social comings and goings and interactivities and various desires and challenges and opportunities that you do in daily life. These are used for distraction purposes. People lose themselves in the light. They run into the world. And then they get into these allegiances, and then they get into other forms of dependency and codependency. So what did I started myself to see? Is that yes, you have this historical, bona fide, historical, and I believe largely provable acts of direct oppression and tyranny from an external source, off-world source, and then the descendants of those people who set up governments and tyrannies and wars and territorial actions and boundaries and countries. You have all of that. You have that motion. But you can never also then not notice that you have individually in the psyche of each individual the hierarchy, the tyranny, the devil within. You have the demon within. So one is just reciprocal of the other. And as my researches took me further, I started to realize that, look, that is the most important form of tyranny. The most important form of tyranny is the inner one, the internal one in the inner republic. And I'm not dumb enough to think that everybody's going to turn themselves into a philosopher and start dealing with this. But I think that the most important people, the people who really want to crack it, and the ones who are deeply moved by the Dharma, what are they here for? What is their actual purpose? You see, no manual can teach you that. No map exists, no A to Z. And what will happen is a seeker will always go through all the different paths, all the different religions, and they have to then discover, as Nietzsche did, that wait a minute, some of these religions are also in place as filters, as nets, to stop you on that process. That the Big Brother system has also made sure that they have their schools, their colleges, their madhouses, their bedlams, their intellectual fraternities, their clubs, and their religions, to in fact impede you upon the journey that they know within you exists.
That's right. They build our societies so that we have this reverse schizophrenia type of society where we think that everything is the way that they tell us it is, but we're so busy looking at that we don't see that they're manipulating us on the inside.
Right, and remember, it's born from a virtue. Of course, it's a natural thing of a good man to project his goodness onto others. He just doesn't see, until you become like a Hamlet, that there's so many problems come with that, with you projecting your virtues. Most of this is born out of virtue. This is why it's so devilish. Because the system understands what good men will do. They know that they serve. They feel obligated. They don't want to see other people hurt. They want to help their brothers, you see. So all of this stuff is born out of virtue. But when you try to address it, as I do, people think that you're bashing virtue, or that you're yourself, not right in the head or whatever, or that you're advocating some sort of extremist system. All I'm doing is analyzing what man is. And these organizations exist to impede you. Now what they will do, they send you in so many words. We understand that you've got these impulses. Why don't you sublimate those impulses for the betterment of mankind? So very slowly you get into charity, or you say, yeah, I'll turn all this angst and this desire to be my own person into some sort of inventiveness. I'll invent the train. I'll invent the steam engine. I'll invent the plow. And you turn those inventions into things that will continue society. So society has made a loophole for you. It understands that you have this primal inner drive to discover the meaning of something. But it says, look, we will allow you to have that as long as in some shape or form you egoistically turn it into something that serves the rest of us. Put your mind to that. And that's what man has done. The ultimate version of that, of course, is science, which is ultimately questioning, ultimately dissecting, ultimately seeking some sort of meaning, but it's very practical. It's not spiritual science in which a man turns within into the deepest reservoirs of his being, like a Descartes, like a Heidegger, like a Nietzsche, to really question who and what he is. And he's meant to sort of turn that into some utilitarian, practical device or invention that furthers his society. There's nothing wrong with it. I'm just saying that that's the way that this drive, this impulse for independence is co-opted many times. And so that's why you have these sort of eccentric, mad, even very much sinister genius types who, sort of like some sort of Boris Karloff, Bela Lugosi mad scientist who'll skin a woman alive in order to save the human race or whatever, and doesn't see, the travesty of what he's doing or whatnot. So this is kind of the way that society's been progressing. Now it's all right to become technically proficient. It's all right to keep out the storms and challenges of life in order to be secure. But what is happening along the line, and it's certainly pertinent to where we are today since the time of the Industrial Revolution, is that you can only leave the psyche, you can only leave your inner republic, fallow for so long. You can only neglect it for so long until neuroses starts to creep in. And so that is what has been happening historically. Although the affluence and the leisure time and the intellectual understandings have progressed at phenomenal rate. And if you look at my Atlantis work, I also insist that is probably the reason, is because the Nephilim who came here were very advanced scientifically. So they've, of course, made it easy for that level to develop, much less the other side. But if you leave the emotional and you leave the spiritual, then you may make the most beautiful, scintillating, paradisical society to, on paper. But it will actually be a living hell to be in.
That's right.
And many movies have shown this from the time of Doctor Who onwards, that the most perfect societies, in every which way, everything's automated, everything's at your fingertips, all sorts of virtual realities and sexual distractions are made available for you. So all these other needs are sort of satiated. But underneath that, because you have murdered your selfhood and you have given yourself over to the hive mentality, you rot from within. And then nature devises yet another means, you see, to bring in some element that will then bring that civilization down. Because it's the old Tower of Babel concept that you're building so high.
We're coming up to another network break, Michael.